Canada is often regarded as almost a safe haven, full of nicer people, nicer landscapes. It's more untouched. It's that raw, nice, welcoming country. But is that true? Canada has the same problems and similar ones as well. When we look back, Canada isn't talked about that much, and if it is, it's talked about almost in a positive light. Yet, Canada has its problems as well, and they're actually just as big. Why don't we learn about them that much? Even today, Canada is shown as the nicer place. Even on their $10 bill, on the back, they even list one of the Charter Rights of Freedoms, Section 15, that states, "Every individual is equal before and under the law, and has the right to the equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination." Is that true in history? Not even close. Canada actually has its own deep racist history, with things like the Chinese head tax, assimilation and violence towards First Nations, and even a few branches of the KKK. In many ways, Canada was and still is just as bad in America. When America had things like segregated black and white schools and neighborhoods, Canada is well known for their residential schools. Residential schools were government-sponsored religious schools established to assimilate Indigenous children into Euro-Canadian culture. Originally conceived by Christian churches and the Canadian government as an attempt to both educate and convert Indigenous youth and to integrate them into Canadian society, causing long-term problems among Indigenous peoples. Since the last residential school closed in 1996, former students have pressed for recognition and restitution, resulting in the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement in 2007 and a formal public apology by Prime Minister Stephen Harper in 2008.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools.
In total, an estimated 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children attended residential schools. 1996 wasn't that long ago, just a little over 20 years. That shows how recent these problems in Canada were. And that's not where the comparisons stop. Where America had anti-black propaganda and violent racism towards African Americans and a deep history of that, Canada had anti-Asiatic laws and racism or mistreatment towards Chinese workers. The workers were brought in when Canada was building its famous railroad across from sea to sea that spans the whole width of Canada. It was built by Asiatic workers, mostly Chinese workers, and they were given unfair circumstances to work, unfair wages, they were working in unsafe conditions, even though when they started working they were promised the opposite of all those. They were promised ample wages, but they got more segregation. But perhaps the most jarring thing about the racism towards Chinese people in Canada was the Chinese head tax. The Chinese head tax was levied on Chinese immigration to Canada between 1885 and 1923 under the Chinese Immigration Act. With few exceptions, Chinese people had to pay $50, later raised to $100, then $500 to come to Canada. This anti-Chinese legislation was the first in Canadian history to exclude immigration on the basis of ethnic origin. Even today, these things linger in Canada. Things like First Nations reserves still happen today. 49% of First Nations members live on remote reserves. So why are these such big misconceptions about Canada? Why are most of these things I've talked about today not well known?
Well, there are a few reasons. One major one is that, while Canada is in no way immune to corrupt or racist politicians, especially on the historical side of things, we definitely have had some politicians, and particularly prime ministers, who have been good at keeping up appearances and, at the very least, making it seem like they really support social justice initiatives. A good example of this is both of the Trudeaus. Pierre Trudeau, before he even became prime minister, helped introduce the Criminal Law Amendment Act. Among other things, this decriminalized homosexuality and legalized contraception and abortion, although on very specific conditional terms. He later implemented the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which laid out a lot of basic human rights, and is actually the source of the quote on the $10 bill about equality. However, Pierre Trudeau wasn't necessarily always socially just. At one point, he tried to get rid of the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs and wanted to sell some reserve land to private buyers. However, there was backlash against this from activists, and he dropped the whole thing. Pierre Trudeau's son, Justin Trudeau, is currently Prime Minister. And in the time that he's been Prime Minister, he has issued several public apologies.
We are sorry for not apologizing sooner.
For instance, he's apologized for residential schools. However, many people, including, interestingly enough, Pierre Trudeau, fault the method of government apology for historical events because it's honestly not really doing anything to support the hurt community and is doing more for government appearances than to actually further social justice. Another reason that people have these misconceptions is that they really just know more about American history, or their own history, than Canadian history. Now, despite not being American, we actually learn a lot about American history in school, sometimes more so than about Canadian history, which is why Canada is known for its role in things like the Underground Railroad or housing American draft dodgers during the World Wars. It's not that Canada didn't have its own problems at the time, it's just that the things that we hear about are how it compares to America. A third reason why people have these misconceptions is because Canada is just known for being polite, kind. This stereotype can lead people to believe that we don't have as many problems or that people aren't as likely to be racist. And it makes it a lot easier to ignore racism or other types of discrimination when they do happen.
Today we have groups fighting to challenge these misconceptions and change what's going on.
I'm here because I have been guided here by something that means more to us and more to me than anything in this world.
To bring Canada's ugly past over the shiny place we all love and really show the struggle that this country has gone through and the people who had to stand up to try and change it. This is all to educate people so they realize, and even today, Canada isn't such a safe place after all. These people are fighting for knowledge across all peoples of all the world so they can understand Canada's issues.